Gdansk, Poland. As the country's principal seaport and the centre of its fourth largest metropolitan area, Gdansk is not only one of Poland's main cities, but has also been at the heart of seismic events in recent Polish and European history. During the 1980s, Gdansk shipyard gave birth to the Solidarity trade union movement, whose opposition to the government led to the end of Communist Party rule in 1989 and sparked a series of protests that would eventually topple the regimes of the former Soviet bloc. Yet the history of Gdansk is not uniquely Polish, and for centuries, Poles and Germans have fought over control and ownership of the city. The Germans call the city Danzig, and prior to 1945 it had been predominantly German-speaking. However, at the end of the Second World War, as Soviet forces advanced into Prussia, the people of Danzig were forced to flee the city. Eva Allen was one of the German inhabitants who were part of the exodus out of Danzig. Her story starts as that of a 14-year-old girl, separated from her mother as she fled from the city in a refugee boat. Then, following the occupation of Germany in 1945 and finding herself in the Soviet-occupied sector, Eva chose to escape to the West. It was in the West that she fell in love with a Scottish soldier, and it was he who invited her to move to Glasgow, where they would get married and raise 3 sons. Eva was born Eva Piastowski on the 8th of February 1930, and she told me of her early memories of Danzig as she was growing up.
I was born in Danzig and I grew up in Danzig. It was a beautiful city, a lot of merchants, because it was a trading city and they traded over the whole continent. Danzig had lots of farmland outside and they exported wheat and fish, herring and things like that.
At the time Eva was born, Danzig and its hinterland had been cut off from Germany proper following the Treaty of Versailles after the end of World War I. It existed as part of a semi-autonomous free state between the years of 1920 and 1939. And I asked Eva whether that had any bearing in her sense of identity as regards being German.
From the time I was born and went to school, we always knew we were German. We never knew we were any other nationality. We got taught German at school, and we could go to Berlin, we could go anywhere because we were Germans.
Whilst Danzig in the 1930s was predominantly German, there were also a number of minorities living in the city too.
It was quite integrated, a lot of Jews, a lot of Poles, and we all got on. When you grow up, you don't know the difference between a Jew or a Pole. Because, they made no distinction between other people.
Eva told me about her memories of the Second World War.
During the war, we had ration things, but apart from that, we just went our ordinary way. We went to school, as children. And all you were told was there was a war and we would win it. At home, you never spoke about war because you were too small, as children. And you didn't know what was going on. So it was just really in later years that you realized how serious it was.
In Danzig, Eichenlaubträger U-Boot-Kapitän Hartmann, der ein dortiges Bataillon des Volkssturmes aufstellte, im Gespräch mit Gauleiter Forster.
In the final months of the war, with Hitler desperate to turn the course of events back in his favour, a national militia called the Volkssturm was formed. Literally meaning the People's Storm, it was established in a bid to boost the strength and morale of the German army and to help prevent cities like Danzig from falling into enemy hands. Yet despite this last show of resistance, news had filtered through to the people of Danzig that Soviet forces were making inroads into the region and had already cut off the overland route between East Prussia and the Western German territories. Eva, now aged 14, had recently left school and started working as a nanny for a family with 2 small children. The family that she worked for, the Riemanns, had already made plans to leave the city by boat, and they asked Eva if she wanted to join them.
He says, well, go and tell your mum we need to go out of Danzig because the Russians were coming. And he said, I've got a ship booked, and if she's in agreement and she feels you should come with us, he said, we're quite willing to take you.
But with Eva's father already dead, her mother had reservations about allowing her to leave Danzig.
She didn't want me to leave, but the people I was working for with the family, well, they said, if you don't leave and the Russians come, well, you don't know what would have happened to me.
On the 30th of January 1945, with her mother staying behind in Danzig, Eva set off with the Riemann family to Gottenhafen, a city 22 kilometres away, to board a ship bound for Kiel.
He had a car, but we could only go so far because the roads were blocked, with all the people. So we had to go out and go by foot to the ship, which was miles and miles and miles. You couldn't take any suitcases because the snow was so deep. So, you couldn't really carry anything. It was very bitterly cold. The snow was really packed and people was trekking with carts and all their belonging, all trying to go to the port.
Eva and the Riemann family eventually made it on foot to Gottenhafen. But by the time they arrived, the ship had already left. Unbeknownst to Eva at the time, the ship they were due to have boarded was the Wilhelm Gustloff and would never reach Kiel. It was hit by 3 torpedoes from a Soviet submarine in the Baltic Sea on the night that it had left. It is not known exactly how many were on board, but it is estimated there may have been around 9,500 people. Only 949 people survived, and it remains to this day the greatest recorded maritime disaster in history. It would be long after the war had ended that Eva found out about the fate of the ship that she was due to be aboard.
We didn't know till later on. They didn't broadcast it to say, well, the ship you were on was gone. So I didn't really knew well after the war was finished what really had happened when they really made it public how many boats had been sunk. They wouldn't tell you straight away, otherwise people wouldn't have gone on boats.
Eva and the Riemann family were put up in a school whilst they waited for another ship. But with the sheer volume of people fleeing from all over East Prussia, it would be days before they could get on board a ship with enough space to take the 5 of them together. And even that proved to be cramped.
We just had a cabin. There was only one bunk and you had to take in turn to sleep because we couldn't all sleep at the one time. And we weren't allowed on deck.
Although the ships heading to Kiel were part of an operation to withdraw German troops and civilian refugees from East Prussia, they were nonetheless considered a target for Soviet submarines. And every so often the ship's engines would be turned off to avoid detection. Consequently, the journey was long and tiring, and it took Eva and the Riemann family more than a week to reach Kiel. A cousin of Mrs. Riemann lived near Dresden, so after landing in Kiel they headed south to take up the offer of a place to stay. Luckily, they were not staying in the city itself.
Once we got there, very shortly afterwards, we could see all the planes going over and Dresden was flattened. There was nothing left of the city. I believe it's built up now and it's beautiful. I haven't been, but one of my sons, Kenneth, has been, and he said you would never know it was razed to the ground.
On the 1st of July 1945, the inner German border was created as the boundary between the Western and Soviet-occupied zones. Living in Dresden, Eva found herself in the Soviet-occupied zone.
The Russians came in and Germany was divided in 5 sections, and where we were, we came under the Russian zone, So I was fleeing from the Russians and ended up again with the Russians.
Yet with more and more Germans leaving the Soviet zone for the West, relations between the Western Allies and the Soviets were getting increasingly tense, and this manifested itself in a strengthening of the border between East and West Germany. The number of Soviet soldiers on the border was increased, and supplemented with border guards from the newly established East German police, and unofficial crossing points were being blocked with ditches and barricades. Eva sensed that it was time to try and get out.
I met a boy. He had an aunt in Hamburg. He said, well, I can get you to my aunt, but the Russians were patrolling the border because they didn't want anybody to cross over. So we had to do it at night. Oh, it was terrible. And ever so often we had to stop because if they had found us, they probably would have shot us. We got over there and I got a job with his aunt, which wasn't a very happy time because I was really homeless. I was by myself, didn't know any better. As long as I had somewhere to stay, that was all I really cared for. So very often I had to get up quite early in the morning and do the washing. You know, cheap labor, but I had accommodation.
Now living in Hamburg, Eva became friends with a girl who worked for a wealthy industrialist. On her day off, the girl attended a Catholic church, and she invited Eva to join her.
I said, well, I don't know. I said, I'm not a Catholic. She said, oh, well, it doesn't matter what religion you are. She said, yes, come. So on my free day off, we would go at night, and it was probably would be like a Bible class.
It was whilst she was attending the church that Eva learned from the priest of an opportunity to live and work at the home of a British Army family who were looking for a home help. Yet Eva, who at the time only spoke German, was apprehensive.
I said, well, I don't speak English. I said, I don't know much about it. So the priest came and he said, well, I'll take you and see if the woman likes you. So it was a colonel and a Mrs. Alexander. So when they saw me, she always thought I would never be able to do anything because I was really undernourished and was so thin. But I think she must have taken pity on me. So she said yes, she would take me. But of course, I didn't know any English, so every morning she would say, this is a cup, and all the implements what we had, she would sort of tell me. And it was just like home from home. They had food, and from then on, I really got on my feet. I was on a train and I was speaking to somebody. You know how you often speak to people on a train. And she asked me where I came from, and I told her all my story and that I had lost my mother and I was really all by myself. But now I was working for a British family, and you know, I was quite content and everything was fine. So she said, give me your name and give me your mother's name, because at 1 o'clock they announced people who was looking for somebody. I think it was run by the Red Cross. And she said, well, if you give me your name and where you are, where you're staying now, and that you're looking for your mother, Eva Piastowski. And she said, if you listen to the radio, but then, I couldn't listen to her radio, so I didn't know anything about it.
When Eva had left Danzig with the Riemann family, her mother had chosen to remain there. Yet it would not be long before the Soviet army had captured the city.
Well, My mother didn't leave Danzig. They were literally put out on a cattle track, and they were all put out of Danzig. From what I hear from my mother, she was glad that I had gone because it was overrun with the Russians, and the troops they had put in were absolutely horrendous. They raped women, and, I don't know what would have become of me if I had stayed.
Having been put in a cattle truck out of Danzig, Eva's mother did not know where she would end up. Unbeknownst to each other, Eva and her mother had ended up living in the same city, Hamburg.
She got a job in a factory. I think it was an American factory. They made combs. So while she was working in the factory, one of her colleagues had said, I think, she said, I heard your name on the radio. Have you got a daughter, Eva? And she said, yes. She said, well, she's looking for you.
But as it turns out, just before the time that Eva's mother had heard that her daughter was living in Hamburg, the British Army family had been transferred to Badenhausen and had offered Eva the chance to join them.
He said, do you want to come with us or do you want to stay in Hamburg? I knew, what I was going to, so I said, I'll come. So I went. When my mother went to the house where we were before we went to Badenhausen, the neighbor said, yes, there was a colonel and his family staying there, but they're gone away. I don't know where they're gone. In Germany, you have it, if you change your address, you tell the police where your next address is. So she went to the police and they could tell her that I had gone to Badenhausen. So I got a letter. She wrote a letter to see where she was in Hamburg.
The letter included Eva's mother's phone number, which Eva promptly phoned. It was the first time she had spoken to her mother in years.
I told the family I'd found my mother. So he said, well, I'll take you down, and he took me down to Hamburg.
It was October 1951 and Eva attended a Halloween party at a British-German club in Badenhausen.
Where there's music, I'll paint the tunes. Where there's heaven.
It was there that she met Bob Allen, a young Scottish soldier.
I said, what attracted you? He said, well, you wore no makeup. Well, in those days, I don't think many girls wore makeup like they wear now. I was blonde and I really had beautiful hair. And we seemed to hit it off.
Eva and Bob started dating and soon became inseparable. Bob, however, was reaching the end of his national service and was due to be demobbed and returned home to Glasgow.
We knew we would have wanted eventually to marry, but he says, I tell you what, if you want, we'll go to Glasgow and you can meet my mother and father and all the family. And he said, you can see how you like Glasgow. And so I stayed with them for a fortnight with his mother and father. And I was made very welcome. He tried to get me a visa to come to Scotland, and I got a job in Edinburgh as a nanny with a doctor and his family. And on my day off, either Bob would come to Edinburgh from Glasgow or I would go to his parents' house.
In 1954, Bob and Eva got married and went on to raise 3 boys, David, Kenneth and Andrew. I asked Eva whether she got to see her mother much after she moved.
She came periodically. We went with the children to Hamburg, and she remarried again. And then after my stepfather died, she used to come over for about 3 months or so. She died in 1982.
Eva took out British citizenship, but as a former German inhabitant of Danzig, a city now under Polish control and behind the Iron Curtain, she was very wary about travelling back to the city of her birth.
I would never go back because I had a British passport. And we went to Dubrovnik 1 year on holiday. And when we went to the passport office, he took my passport and he went away with it. And I was breaking out in sweat. And it took him quite a while before he came back. He gave me back my passport and he said, have a nice holiday. And of course, all the people were wanting to know why he took my passport away. So all later on we could think of, because I was born in Danzig.
During the 1980s, Eva did return to Danzig. Although by that time it had been repopulated by Poles, certain aspects hadn't changed since her childhood. Yet what she found most striking was just how different life there had become to that in the West.
By that time it was still very, very primitive. It still had the old tram cars, which I can remember as a child. Food was quite scarce and they didn't have the variety than what we had in the West. Even if you looked for anything, I had forgotten to take a bathing suit. And somebody said, well, there are not many shops, but everywhere you go, they have the same bathing suits, the same price.
More recently, Eva's son Kenneth offered to take her back to Danzig on a cruise with his family.
If you want, he says, I will take you back once more to Danzig because Kenneth has been on business and he said, I think you would enjoy it now. They went and unfortunately I couldn't go.
Possible Germany, likely Japan.
Eva has lived in Scotland since 1952 and couldn't imagine living back in Germany.
I don't really follow much what goes on in Germany because living now here and being so long away from it, it's no point harking back to I would never go back because I wouldn't fit in. You know, you don't fit in after all those years. The longer you stay away from a place and you go back, it's harder.
Yet whilst Eva doesn't keep up with events in Germany, she nonetheless felt elated at the fall of the Berlin Wall.
When they knocked the wall down, you know, in Berlin, you felt, well, at least those peoples were free now.
On the day the wall came down, they threw the locks onto the ground. And with
I lived in the Russian zone and I knew what it was like before I went over to the West. You know, everybody was watching one another. You know, you couldn't even trust your own neighbor. If you said something or complained about the state and somebody reported you, you would end up in prison. You know, you had to watch what you were saying.
World War II was the deadliest military conflict in history in terms of the number of deaths recorded. Over 60 million people were killed in just 6 years, which, to put it into perspective, was about 3% of the world's population at the time. Whilst interviewing Eva in the comfort of her home and in peacetime, it was sometimes too easy to forget just how serious war is, and just how lucky she was to have been able to tell me her story. History is written as the story of army generals, of monarchs, politicians, statesmen and power brokers. Rarely, however, does it document the lives of the ordinary citizens. Yet real human history is actually the collective stories of these individuals, for these are our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. and it is only through their choices and their decisions that we are here today.